Thank you to the team here at White Cube. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with Minoru Nomata tonight. We first met a couple of months ago in Tokyo when I had the pleasure of visiting Minoru's studio in Setagaya. Setagaya is a leafy, quiet neighborhood in the southwest of the city, and it's the kind of neighborhood that Minoru has spent most of his life living and working. So I had the pleasure of seeing many of the works that we're surrounded by this evening in Minoru's studio, but like a lot of studios in Tokyo, it's a pretty compact space. So I've only ever seen these works probably at a distance of 1 to 2 meters, all abutting, overlapping one another. And it's, a great pleasure to see them installed so beautifully here at White Cube, but also quite a shock as well. And I'm still getting used to being in such a large space and seeing them breathe and float and shimmer in all kinds of new ways. This is Minoru's first show, remarkably, in London, and I think it's a particularly resonant context for him, both in terms of the collections that we have here in London, but also the architectural history. We're going to be talking about both of those, I think, this evening. But Minoru was remarking to me yesterday, having visited the National Gallery, that seeing paintings by Tiepolo, seeing paintings by Veronese, was saying, oh, this is where my skies are coming from. And at the same time, I suppose I'm mindful of the fact that thinking about the histories of the architecture of the Industrial Revolution, thinking about the Crystal Palace that was installed not so far away from here in 1851, these are important touchstones for Minoru, and we're going to be exploring some of these different histories this evening. So I know that some of you here know Minoru's work very well. For many, this will be an introduction. So I'm going to talk for maybe 5 minutes to give a little bit of that context before we get into exploring this exhibition, but Minoru's work more broadly. For 40 years, Minoru has been painting what I think we could call forthcoming places, to borrow a title from a series of his from the mid-90s. He's had, for 4 decades, a really singular focus. He's been coming back in different ways to these hybrid structures that are eerily unpeopled and that seem to borrow from different periods in time and place. I think often we don't know where we are when we're looking at Minoru's work, or indeed where we are either. We might think of kindred spirits like Piranesi or the impossible structures of M.C. Escher. We might think of De Chirico's emptied plazas too. Minoru tends to work in series. One slowly unfurls into the next, lays the seeds for the next. We see certain kinds of forms, certain typologies recur, grow from one series to the next. And by my count, I think he's created about 30 series over the last 40 years or so. The titles of those series give a remarkable window into his preoccupations. I'll give a few of them here. Structures, picturesque, sublime, or land escapes. And that's a term I think we're going to be coming back to, land escapes. So among all of these different typologies, we see pavilions, we see palaces, we see arenas, we see arches, we see towers. These are all human-designed constructions, but we are somehow nowhere to be seen. I first encountered Minoru's work last year at an exhibition at Tokyo Opera City Gallery, and I think what I was immediately struck by was the kind of precedents from the world of visionary architecture. So I'm thinking of really singular figures like Etienne Louis Boullée, who in the years after the French Revolution was imagining these monumental unbuilt forms made of pure geometric shapes, spheres, columns that we see echo through Minoru's work. I also thought of some of the floating cities that were imagined by Soviet constructivist architects in the 1920s or some of their contemporaries working in Germany at that same time. And I know some of these figures are important ones for Minoru. With all of these visionary architectural proposals, they're all proposals for alternative ways of living, alternative ways of seeing the universe. And I think for me, Minoru's enigmatic buildings belong both to the world of antiquity and myth on the one hand, but also to the future as well. And it's probably no coincidence that for some of us seeing these works, they might recall different imaginations that we see in sci-fi films from the 60s, 70s, through to today. I think of the films of Denis Villeneuve and some of these huge floating forms we see in Arrival in June. Minoru is overwhelmingly an elemental painter. He's made series that explore light, that explore stone, air, wind, and then most recently water and what Irene, you've called hydrological forms, right? The kinds of icebergs, glaciers, waterfalls as well that are surrounding us this evening. So we'll be exploring some of these questions of planetary crisis, of some of the turn that Minoru's work took, I think, after Fukushima in 2011. But I'll just conclude by saying that for Minoru, painting is a field that he's talked about in terms of energy, a place that we can go to energize ourselves. So as much as these might seem like glimpses of other worlds, other universes, other times, I think for Minoru, they are ways in which that we can go and spend time and return closer to the world. They're not escapist visions, they're a lens for getting closer to the here, getting closer to the now. So without further ado, I'm going to move to my first question. And the first thing that I'd like to ask you, Minoru, is really about the title of this exhibition. Continuum was also the title of your show in Tokyo last year. In a way, it's the connective strand between those two presentations. And I'd love to know a little more about what does that title mean to you?
こんにちは野方です。このコンティニウムって言葉を僕初めて知ったのは実はかなり昔でジャコ・パストリアスのベーシストなんですけどね、彼のソロアルバムの中でコンティニウムっていう曲が実はあって、それがとても好きで、それをだからもう10年以上前から時々聴いてたんですけど、その時初めてそのコンティニウムという言葉の意味を知りました。
Hello. It came from my favorite music. It's a title of a song by Jaco Pastorius. He's a bass player. And about 10 years ago, I heard that song. It's from his solo album. And it just struck me. It's a song that I really like.
それでなんかずっとその曲を時々聴き続けていたんですけれど、でこの今のシリーズを作る時ちょうどコロナが終わってでウクライナで戦争があったり、あと気候変動があったり、他にもいろんな国でさまざまな紛争が起きてて、何かそういうものがとてもなんかこう自分の今まで内側の世界をやってたんだけど、そこにどんどん侵食してきたんですね。そんな時にやはりこうそれらがなんかこう自分の絵のなんかこうどんどん中心にどんどん近くなってきて、ちょっとこれは今までと違う絵になりそうだなと思いながら、制作していました。
So I always thought sometimes I play that tune every now and again. And when I was working on a series that became this one, COVID just ended, and then came the war in Ukraine, and climate change was getting more serious, and all the conflicts in the world. My style was always about myself, inner self. And then I sort of, I was feeling that what was happening in the world was coming into my inner world, if you like. And I started to feel that, oh, my style is actually, my art is changing.
Thank you. Just to mention, in Minoru's studio, it's absolutely full of CDs. Every surface is stacks and stacks of CDs, particularly ambient music, a lot of jazz, and we might want to come back to that, I think. But sticking with this idea of inner worlds, I think so many of the architectural forms in your paintings do somehow speak to memory, or they speak to dream spaces. And in terms of memory, I would be so curious to know what your own earliest memories of architecture were growing up in Tokyo in the 50s and 60s.
僕は東京タワーを建築中の時に自分の祖父に連れられてそれを見た記憶がとても強くあって、あと隣が日本のお風呂屋さんっていうんで高さが30メートル以上ある煙突を見上げながらずっと育ってきました。そして家の前には木工の工場があって、いつもなんか木の大きなかけらが家の前に転がってて、なんかそういうものでずっと遊んでて、何かこう構造を見たり作ったりっていうことがすごく日常的でした。
Growing up, I was really little, but my grandfather took me out, and I was actually looking at Tokyo Tower being built and growing taller. And next to my house was a bathhouse, public bathhouse, and there's this 30-meter plus chimney. So I just grew up looking at architecture. And also in front of my house, there was a woodwork studio. So again, I was growing up looking at all these wood blocks, and I was actually playing with them. So I was so used to looking at structures and making structures, I think.
あと僕が生まれた時っていうのはすでに東京オリンピック1964年の東京オリンピックの準備が東京中で行われてて、いつもなんか街中が建築建物を作ってる最中だったんですね。それに対して建物が対する何かこうなんていうんだろう、作る未来の姿に対してなんかすごく期待感を持っていました。
And I remember 1964, the Tokyo Olympics and the time running up to it. Everything was exciting, and all these buildings were being built, and I thought that was kind of like a hope for the future, and all this anticipation from everyone, including myself.
You were growing up at a tremendously exciting time for architecture in Japan. So you mentioned the 1964 Olympics. I also think about the Metabolist architects, for example, who kind of launched with their manifesto in 1960, or later the Expo in 1970 in Osaka, which, as you say, was a kind of vision of the future.
僕は万博は直接行っていないんですけれど、東京という街自体が、江戸の頃からですけれど、何かこう常に何か壊れたらどんどん作り変えていくっていう街なんですね。で特に今でもそれは変わってなくて、20年30年で建築はどんどん変わっていくっていうのが東京の今の姿で、ですからそういう特別なメタボリズムではなく、もうそもそも東京という街がそういう資質を持っている街なんですと思ってますね。
I didn't go to the Osaka Expo in 1970, but I think Tokyo is always changing, has always been changing since the Edo era. Towns been somehow destroyed, and they rebuilt, and they repeated that over the years. And I think it's still the same. So I think architecture in Tokyo has been changing every 20, 30 years, I think. So the metabolism isn't really a special movement, because that was something that happens regularly. And I think that's what Tokyo is.
Within this rapidly changing context, within this kind of context of flux and development, at what point did you start drawing I think I remember you talking about your parents being working in the kimono industry. And so presumably this kind of idea of draftsmanship was something that was in the background for you growing up.
そうですね、なんか大人は働くっていうイメージがあって、そういう、労働、肉体労働っていうか、オフィスで働くんではなくて何かを作るっていうのが僕の町の風景だったので、何かそれはもうなんかそういうふうになるものだっていうふうに僕は思っていましたね、大人になるということは。
So growing up, I was looking at all these grown-ups around me. Okay, grown-ups, they work. But work, by work, I mean labor, proper labor. So grown-ups around me weren't working in offices. So they're craftspeople. So yeah, that was my sort of natural way of thinking, right? When I grew up, I will work, meaning I'll be doing some sort of labor using my hands and skills.
And you went on to study at Geidai, and you studied painting there. This was in the late 1970s. Who were the artists, who were the painters who were on your mind at that time that you were encountering as a student at that point?
やはり僕は西洋美術が中心の教育を受けたので、やはりルネサンスの画家であったりですが、そんな中でたまたま僕はなんかブックストアのバーゲンでチャールズ・シーラーっていう本をたまたま手に入れたんですけど、でそれまで全く知らなかったんですね。でそこに煙突が書かれていて、自分の毎日見てる風景にとても似てるっていうことで、煙突書いてもいいんだなってその時初めて思って、それからちょっとなんとなく自分にもアートができるのかもしれないというふうな思いになりました。
So yeah, I studied what we call the Western art. So obviously Renaissance art and all that I studied, and I was influenced by it. But I went to this second-hand bookshop, and there was this bargain box with all these cheap books in. And I came across a book of Charles Sheeler, an American artist. I didn't know anything about it, but I bought it anyway. And what he drew, what he painted were chimneys, chimneys that I ate like the chimney I was looking at. And I thought, right, I can do this. I can draw what I know, and I can be an artist. I can do art. So that was the moment that I thought, I can do this.
That's fascinating, yeah. And Charles Sheeler may not be, I think, as well known in Europe as he is in North America, but an artist associated with the Precisionist movement, the 1920s, who was responding to these redevelopments in cities in the US, but also photography as well. Very, very interested in the photography of Paul Strand. And as Minoru is saying, these new tower blocks, these new chimneys that are suddenly popping up around him. Were there other artists who were on your mind at that time?
あとこの間見たナショナルギャラリーでベロネゼとかティエポロとかその辺の、あとその辺のベネツィア派の絵画っていうのは僕好きだったんで、改めて見ていいなと、ベースになって空の色なんか随分影響を受けてます。
And I went to the National Gallery with you, and obviously you know about Tiepolo and Veronese and all these Italian arts, and the sky, the color of the sky, it's just nothing like their color, and I feel like a kindred spirit with them.
After you graduated in 1979, I know that you went to work in a branding agency, an advertising agency, so McCann Erickson Hakuhodo, which kind of common to lots of Japanese artists of your generation, actually, finding work in the world of commercial design. We've spoken a little bit about this before. I think you might feel a little ambivalent about your time there, but I wonder how those 5 years you spent working as a design director fed into the work that you were making in the 1980s, if at all?
僕はデザイン科に形成デザインっていうところなんですけど、西洋やイスラム文様や文様を学ぶ科なんですね。でなんでデザイン科に行ったかっていうと、これからはデザインだと思ったんですよ。アートはね、なんかこう古臭いもので、デザインがこれからの世界だと思って、で僕はデザイン科に行ってまずそこだけを訳してください。
Right. So I actually studied in the Department of Design, and so what was specialized in was patterns of Western art or like Islam Muslim art. So it was sort of closer, it's more like design than art. And I thought, well, fine art is old. Design is now new. So I went to study design at the university.
そんなわけでデザイン科に入ったんですけれど、でいざ就職ってなると、デザイン科出た人間は当時はそういう広告に入るのが一番理想的な進路だったんですね。でマッキー・ニクソンという、外資系の入って6年間いたんですけど、4年ぐらいコカ・コーラの仕事をずっとしてて、やっぱりそういうクライアント仕事っていうのはクライアントの望む姿で描かなきゃ表現しなきゃならないので、非常に何かこういつもコカ・コーラは爽やかで元気で躍動的で、それを4年間やってるのはとてもつらかったんですね。でやはりワンクールが3ヶ月っていう短い仕事なので、残る仕事がしたいと思い始めて、もう思い切って辞めてアートの道に行きました。
So back then, students of design departments, for them, the ideal career path was going into major advertising agency. And so I got a job at McCann Erickson, and I worked there I lasted for 4 years. But what I had to do was dealing with clients. At the end of the day, I had to make what they wanted. Say, this product, we need this image of vibrancy or fresh and fine and nice. And it just started to become really, really difficult for me. And also in advertising, one project only lasts about 3 months, and then you want a new advert. And I began to feel like I want to make something that would last longer than that.
And when you did move on from working there, you quite quickly had your first solo exhibition at Segacho Exhibit Space. Incredibly important, pioneering alternative space in Tokyo that I think has some parallels to what PS1 in New York was doing in its early years. You had 2 shows there, and I suppose I'd like to think a little bit about the kinds of approaches to display you were taking with those exhibitions, to the ways in which you were using the space, and while you were making paintings from the beginning, they were very rarely hung on the wall, right, or directly on the wall. So at those Segacho's shows, one of them you were suspending the paintings from the ceiling. In another you had poles with the works installed on them. I think it seems that from very early on you had quite a sculptural sense of how paintings might operate within a space. And yeah, I would love to know a little bit more about how you approached then and now the making of the exhibition, the realization of an exhibition in a space.
初めの展示というのは壁がない空間だったんで、仕方なく何かしなきゃと思ったんですね。でそんな時にその頃 小池和子さんっていう無印良品に関わった方が作られたスペースなんですけど、初めインスタレーションを考えてって言われたんですけれど、インスタレーションって何だか分かんなかったんですね。で調べてなんかこう展示みたいだなと思って、そしてもうでその時やったのが空間に吊るして絵の下を通れるようにして、でなんかこうあまり結果的に権威的じゃないっていうか、空想の絵が空間に浮かんでるっていうものになったんで、それ以来自分はそういうポジションの人間になりたんだろうなとうっすら思い始めて、でそれをずっと持続しているっていう感じですね。
It was well, it was like a sheer chance, actually. The space itself, there was no wall at my first exhibition, so I had to do it. There was no way to display my paintings just because there was no space no wall to hang my paintings. And the exhibition space was created by Kazuko Koike, who was involved in Muji. And so she actually said to me, right, you might want to do something like installation. I thought, right, okay, what's an installation? I really had to look up what it is. I thought, aha. So then I looked at the space and I thought, oh, it'd be quite interesting to have my exhibition where the guests' audience can actually walk underneath my paintings. So that's where the idea came from. And also, I wanted to do something unconventional, something a little bit different. So I think the floating paintings would be great to create sort of like an imaginary world. Then I thought, right, that might be the direction that I want to take as an artist.
You were also, at that point, exhibiting some of the models of these buildings, of these structures as well. And in the back room here at White Cube, you can see some of these fragments of maquettes that Minoru uses to think through some of these paintings. I'd like to talk a little bit about your process. In your studio, you were showing me the sketches that you make that sit behind all of these paintings, as well as the scrapbooks too. Perhaps you could talk about how you're sketching, how you're collecting these different archives of images, and how they inform the works that you go on to paint.
スクラップブックを一番初めに始めたのはね、実はその会社を辞める時でしばらく仕事が何にもなかったんですね。それでライブラリに行っていろんなナショナルジオグラフィックとか切り抜いてで持って帰って、それからスクラップが始まったんですけれど、あとスケッチもなんかもうとにかく頭によぎったものは何でもいいから描いて、でそういうものをスクラップと何かこうずっと何も意識せずにやっていくと、何か一つ出来事があるとそれが一つの形にまとまっていくことがあるんですね。でスクラップブックの中には過去と現在と未来が知らないうちに集まっていて、過去に関心があったこと、今関心があること、なんだか分かんないけど面白いな、でそれがこう混ざってスケッチと合体し始めて、何か事件とか起きた時に一つの形になっていくという感じですね。
So I started that scrapbook when I left that job at the advertising agency because I had nothing to do. There was no job, so I just started doing it. So I went to a library or just pick up magazines like National Geographic, and I just started making a scrapbook. The sketchbook that you mentioned, I just started to draw or write something, anything that came to my mind. I wasn't planning anything, I wasn't thinking anything at all. And then after a while, I started seeing something, bits and pieces of the scrapbook or the sketchbook. I started to feel like something's kind of taking some sort of shape. And also, when you think about past, present, and future, so there are, and when you look at my scrapbooks or sketchbook, I can see what I was interested in the past, and also I can see what I'm interested in the present now. And also, then I start to think, well, what would I be interested in the future? And, and then just take notes of everything. And then anything might happen, and then again, that might take some sort of form, and that become part of my creation.
These scrapbooks are really meticulously and beautifully laid out. They seem much closer to me to like magazine layouts than they do scrapbooks. You know, they're quite extraordinary things in themselves, but as you say, a kind of a resource that you continue to draw on.
そうですね、とにかくスペースを埋めることしか実は考えてないんですけれど、あとその中で色や意味をちょっと揃えることもありますけど、作るのに一冊埋まるのに 2,3 年はかかります。すでにもう40、50冊あるんですけど、いつもオーバーラップしてサイズに合うものを選ぶのが大変で結局時間がかかっちゃうんですね。
The scrapbook, basically what I like doing about it is just filling the space. And sometimes I think about colors or meanings and try to get some sort of a category, if you like, but just randomly filling the space. And it takes about 2-3 years to finish one. And I've got 40 to 50 scrapbooks now. And some of the contents might overlap, or I think about layouts, so it just takes quite a while, but I've got 40, 50 collections of my scrapbooks.
As I mentioned, the other thing in your studio is music, right? CDs. You live very close to a great record store, Kankyo Records. I remember talking a little about this when I visited. But how does the kind of music that you're listening to that keeps you company in your studio, how does it infuse the works that you're making?
あんまり自分の中が空っぽの時になんかエネルギーを注入することがあったり、あとこの音楽そのものからイメージする時も、すごくいろんなケースがあって、あと音楽の中身だけじゃなくてジャケット、昔はレコードジャケット、イギリスのだから僕レコードジャケット LP の頃の時代のレコードにすごくグラフィックにすごくなんか関心を持てたりしてて、音楽そのものとプラスそのパッケージもね、すごくイメージが一緒になんかもらえるっていうかなイメージですね。
So the music could be my fuel when I'm sort of empty. The music can be my fuel. Just feel energy from music, and also the image that the tunes can create. And also, we mustn't forget the album sleeves. And I quite like the graphics of the UK album sleeves. So, and obviously the graphics, I'm interested in that side of it. But music's not just the music, but whole package can be my inspiration.
We were talking just before the event about Brian Eno as well.
これはね、僕その会社に勤めた時たまたまなんか夜なんかバーみたいに行ったらなんだか分かんない音楽がかかっていてジャケットが飾ってあって、そしたらなんか「アナザーグリーンワールド」っていうアルバムで、その時からこんな人がいるんだって、その時なんかこう自分のビジョンがそれまでなんかこうアメリカ的な広い世界だったのがそうじゃない、なんかどこか知らない街になんかこうなんかビジョンが移ったって気がする。その時以来なんか自分が変わった気がするんですね。
So I was still working at the advertising agency, and I went to this bar at night, and there's this music playing in the background, and that was an album of Brian Eno, Another Green World, and I thought, wow. Who is this? And well, there's someone, a musician, doing something completely different. I was really struck by it. And my vision then was more sort of like a big wide world like America, and including my taste in music. But Eno's music provoked me into thinking, oh, this is nowhere. or somewhere but nowhere, a town that I don't know and I want to explore. So my vision sort of certainly changed, and it really changed my vision as an artist.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this idea of kind of nowhere and somewhere feels critically important to all of the works that you've been making. In terms of this most recent series, Continuum, and the works that we're surrounded by this evening, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how you moved from painting architecture, painting kind of human-designed structures, to thinking more about landscapes, or these ice-scapes, or this melting or drowned world that of course is also shaped by us, but in a different way perhaps.
初めはスタートした時点ではその建物というか構造物はなんかこう自分自身の何かこう、癒しであったりなんか不足したものを何か充足するためのなんかこうそんな機能を持ってた気がするんですけれど、それがなんかこうなんかどんどんきっかけはやっぱりいろんな社会的な問題がなんかもうどんどんこう広がっていったっていうか、それが自分の問題のように感じてきたことがこういう方向にいってるのかな。
Right, so for me, these buildings and architecture were like something that would heal me or fill the void that I have, something to fill me in a way. But at one point in my life, I started looking at more sort of problems in the world, society, and I could see the problems expanding, and I started to think that social problems are my problem, and I hope I'm answering my questions.
それがだからこうちょっと懸念材料、何かこう言葉にするまでもなくちょっと心にちょっと思い浮かんだようなことみたいなことが積み重なって形になってる気がしてて、決してこう説教するつもりもないし、すごくさまざまな要素がさまざまな懸念材料みたいなものが何か合わさった形なのかもしれない。
But it's not like it's not that I'm just trying to make anything a big issue at all. It's more like something that you feel every day, little concerns here and there, and I think they sort of piled up and then became various concerns that started to seep into my art.
And I know that, as we talked about before, Fukushima 311 was something that had a tremendous importance for you and for your work and for your thinking about these different ecosystems, I suppose. Could you talk a little bit more about the kind of turn within your work that happened, whether that was before or in response to those events?
何かこう自分の中でやむにやまれるっていう状況があった時に形になっていくわけで、実は福島の前にやはりワールドトレードセンターのニューヨークの出来事がまずあって、それからそういう建築が崩壊するというものに対するちょっと驚きっていうのがあって、その後福島の問題があって、何かこう福島で僕はディテールが書けなくなっちゃったんですけど、なんかこう自分のやってることってなんかこう前は建築がなんかこう気概というか希望を与えてくれるもんだったんだけど、そういう人間の営みがなんかこうネガティブなことだっていうふうにどんどん自分の中でそれが増幅してきて、さてって今も思い続けてるんですね。
So I mean, I made what I made because I had to make it. and I mean Fukushima and also 9/11 at the World Trade Center. I mean, all these great architecture just collapsing in front of my eyes, and I was astounded by it. And then obviously I saw Fukushima. But before all these things, I thought my work and architecture, was hope for me, positive things, and especially after Fukushima, I just couldn't draw details. I just really couldn't do it. So and I started to look at what humans do as a negative aspect, negative thing overall.
Certainly with this series, I think we start to see less questions of building, less questions of construction, and much more a sense of dismantling, of melting. There's a work just in the back corner there, which reminds me of depictions of Tower of Babel, right? And the Bruegel painting of Tower of Babel. It's a motif that Minoru has looked at before, but 10 or so years ago. But in this instance, it seems to be it's made of ice. It's melting away into the ocean. The movement is suddenly down and into liquid, rather than this upward thrusting movement that had characterized so much of your work before.
まさかこう溶けるものを描くとは思ってもみなかったんですけれど、建築やっぱりこう持ってるエネルギーっていうのは今でも好きなんですけど、だから今自分の中に2人の人間がいて、まだ変わんないのかよって言ってる自分と描きたいという自分がいて、その中でなんかいつも教え合いをしてるという感じでやってて、ただあとやっぱりこう自分の絵のポジションっていうのは想像の世界というところにいたくて、そんな中でやはりあんまりカテゴライズされない絵を描きたいってずっといつも思ってて、あんまりカテゴライズされないと評価されにくいんですけど、なんかやっぱりあんまり自分で枠を作んないようにしたいなっていうふうに思っていますね。
I mean, ice that we never thought started to melt, and so that was really shocking. And I mean, still like the energies that architecture can generate. But so I kind of feel like a bit split. I've got two me as an artist inside me. I still want to work on architecture, and the other side of me is thinking, shall I still carry on? There's always a conflict within myself. But having said all of that, my art, my paintings are imaginary, the world of imagination. And I think my art doesn't belong to any category. I want to believe that I am category free, or that's how I look at my art anyway. So probably it might be difficult for some critics to again categorize me because there's no category.
Thank you. We touched on this earlier, but looking back over all of the works you've made before, I think there are maybe 2 paintings that you've made that have people in, or a human figure, quite early on. And I'm very interested in this absence, or almost total absence, of people in these works. Could you say more about that absence, or perhaps also about why you chose not to pursue the human figure?
まず逆に言うと、なんで人を描かないのかって描かなきゃいけないのかってまず思っている自分がいます。それから友人になんで人がいないのって言われたりもします。で一度描いたものありますけど、描いたらこれは誰だと思ったんですね。この人は誰なんだろう。で人を描くとどうしても服装とか男か女かとかね、なんかファッションまで見ちゃったりするから、これは違うな、なんかこう説明 すごく説明しなきゃなんない状況が増えてしまうので、説明をするのは僕の絵のスタイルじゃないなと思ったんですね。
Okay, can I ask you why do we have to have a person in your painting? And actually, you're not the only one who actually has asked me that question. My friends did ask me a lot. So why don't you? And I thought, right, okay, I'll give it a go, and I did. And then I was looking at my painting. I thought, right, who is this person? And also, I think it makes my art complicated by having a person in it. Because right, you have to draw the clothes, and you have to decide this is a man or woman, and again, fashion. And you really have to explain, not verbally, but you have to explain in the painting. And I thought, no, that's not me. That's not my style.
Yeah, the human form, I think, pins the work to a particular time, to a particular place. And otherwise, these paintings are evading that being pinned down.
そうしないと描けないと思ってます。
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you have to. So yeah, you do.
I think the question of time is a very slippery question within all of your work. The kind of the when of it, the whenness of these paintings. And in an essay about your work published for the Opera City show, one of the essays is titled "Time is Out of Joint," line from Hamlet. Could you reflect a little on this question of time, on this question of being dislocated from time, of being out of joint?
その時間については、10代の後半SF ばかり読んでたんですね。それでなんかもう、大人はこんなこと考えていいんだ、ロジカルじゃない突拍子もない発想で文章を書いていいんだってことをその時知って、それ以来なんかこう何も無意識にそういう時間とか空間っていうのをなんか考えずにものを作るようになりました。
In my late teenage years, I became a huge fan of science fiction books. And it was liberating in a way because you can actually write about something ridiculous. And you're a grown-up. It's completely illogical, insane. But you can build up a story, and a great story even. So I think that's when I started to think about not thinking about time or space.
あとその SF っていうジャンルがどちらかというとカテゴリーでいうとこう下のランクのように思われてて、そういうことに対してもちょっと違和感を持ってて、僕にとってはさっきも言ったけどカテゴリーなしでもう全部文学は文学だと思っていて、なんか SF とそのいわゆるね純文学っていうものが区別されることに対してすごく抵抗を持ってて、自分自身もだからさっきもお話したようにカテゴライズっていうことを否定することにつながってるんですけれど。
And also, science fiction was sort of low in the art and literature world. It was in the low category, and I didn't like it at all. I just didn't feel that was right. Going back to that category about my art, and I think it's kind of the same for me. Literature is literature. Art is art. There's no hierarchy or no finer art or lower art, no higher literature or no lower literature. So science fiction is the same as, well, say, Shakespeare, great novels. And I really, I positively resist that categorization. And yeah.
I think we will have time for questions just before we wrap up. But I'm going to ask one final question, which is, you've now for the last year or so been painting these frozen forms, these melting forms. What happens next for you? What happens next after Continuum, after this series?
本当に意味のない絵を描きたいなと今思っていますね。フォルムと色で何か心は満たされるような、やっぱり僕はあんまり安心感みたいなものが作品で得たいと思っているので、癒されるとかそんなものを作りたいなと思ってますけど。
I want to do paintings that don't have meanings. By that I mean forms and shapes and colors can express some form of emotions, or paintings can evoke positive emotions, or paintings that can heal human souls, or generate positivity, comfort, something like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.